This is a tropical weather outlook for the Atlantic Basin for 2016, provided by the National Weather Service office in Atlanta. During this brief, we'll talk about the latest El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, conditions, and then the predicted ENSO conditions and the potential influence on the tropics. We'll also take a look at the tropical climatology for Georgia, some tropical storm hazards for inland areas, and what are the tropical experts predicting for 2016. But first, here's a quick refresher on the difference between the El Niño conditions and La Niña conditions. On the left screen, you see that the water is warmer than normal, so that's El Niño conditions, and it's warmer than normal over the eastern Pacific. And La Niña is when it's cooler than normal over the eastern Pacific, and these have effects on the atmosphere and especially over the Atlantic Ocean during the tropical season, and we're going to take a look at all that in the next few slides. So what conditions do exist over the Pacific Ocean right now? Our latest sea surface temps show they are warmer than normal, so we have been in an El Niño condition for over a year now, and it's been one of the strongest El Niños on record. But the conditions do show a sign of weakening, with the latest weekly sea surface temperature departures showing some slightly negative numbers starting to show up, especially in the Niño 3.4 and Niño 3 regions of the Pacific Ocean. The computer models ran by the International Research Institute and Climate Prediction Center show that current El Niño conditions are predicted to weaken through the early summer of this year. Most models indicate a transition to ENSO-Neutral by May, June, July timeframe. And then the dynamical models show maybe a transition all the way to La Niña conditions by June, July, August. The statistical models do predict an ENSO-Neutral through early of 2017, so it does look like we will at least be in ENSO-Neutral conditions through the tropical Atlantic season of 2016. Now, a quick look back at the last two tropical seasons where we transitioned from an El Niño to a neutral condition, very similar to what we're expected to occur this year, shows two very active seasons. In 2010, the season produced 19 tropical storms. Of those, 12 became hurricanes, and of those, 5 became major hurricanes. And then, of course, in 2005, the most active tropical season on record, produced 27 tropical storms, and of those, a record 15 hurricanes, and then of those, a record 4 Cat 5 hurricanes out of the 7 major hurricanes that year. So two very active seasons occurred on our last seasons that are very similar to what we're expecting to transition from this year. So what effects would the ENSO-Neutral or La Niña conditions have over the Atlantic Basin? Well, if we transition to an ENSO-Neutral as expected, or if we transition all the way over to La Niña conditions, cooler than normal, then the waters in the East Pacific actually are slightly cooler or near normal, and that produces warmer water in the Western Pacific, and that's where most of the thunderstorm activity would occur. This results in less wind shear moving over the Atlantic Basin. So if we transition to a neutral or La Niña conditions, it results in weaker vertical wind shear across the Atlantic Basin. Both conditions would favor tropical storm development in the Atlantic Basin for 2016. One of the important ingredients also to look at is the sea surface temperatures. The warmer they are, the more conducive it is for development. So I took a look at the average sea surface temperatures for May from 1971 through 2000. And that's on the right side of your screen. And I compared that to the latest May sea surface temperatures on the left side of the screen. These are the latest sea surface temperatures across the Atlantic Basin through May 28, 2016. And if you compare the two, you can see at least the Atlantic Basin is on track or near normal, and maybe even slightly warmer than normal in the parts of the western Atlantic. But what really stands out is how the Caribbean and the southern Gulf are already slightly warmer than normal. So any disturbances moving into this region would be favorable for development. So it does look like that sea surface temperatures would not at this time appear to hinder any development and might actually slightly favor development as disturbances get further west in our Atlantic Basin. So I also wanted to look at the past climatology and our past ENSO-Neutral seasons. I did look at the past 16, And of those, 11 were average or above. And that would make sense since during the ENSO-Neutral season, there's less wind shear across the Atlantic Basin. So we would expect the most of those to be average or slightly above average. And that was the case. Only 5 were below average. Now, an average tropical season produces 12 tropical storms, and of those, 6 become hurricanes, and of those, 3 become major hurricanes. So that's an average season. Now, Georgia was impacted by a tropical storm 9 out of 10 of the last ENSO-Neutral seasons since 1996. And of course, during all this period, the Atlantic sea surface temperatures were all above average. Now, with the possibility of transitioning into a La Niña season, I took a look back at the past 15 La Niña seasons, and the last 10 were above average, 5 were average or below. And Georgia has felt some impact from a tropical storm 10 out of the last 15 La Niña seasons. Continuing to look at the climatology for tropical systems and their impacts on Georgia, a look back at all tropical cyclones tracking within 125 miles of Atlanta since 1990 reveals that since 1990, Georgia did not go more than 2 years without experiencing some impact from a tropical system. Therefore, climatology suggests Georgia should be impacted by a tropical system in 2016, since our last system to impact the area was Andrea in 2013. From the previous slide, it was noted that most of Georgia's storms come from the Gulf Coast region. 2005 was the last year a hurricane hit the north-central Gulf region. In this region, it usually experiences some kind of impact from a tropical system about every 7 to 11 years. 2016 will be 11 years since this region was last hit, and that was Katrina in 2005. So climatology would indicate that they are due for a tropical system in 2016 as well. Just a quick reminder that it doesn't take very long, maybe just a few days, for a tropical system to develop into a major hurricane and be moving inland on you. And Katrina was one example of that. In just 7 days, it went from a disturbance to a major hurricane that became one of the most devastating hurricanes in U.S. history, responsible for over 1,200 deaths and $75 billion in damage. So these systems can develop in a hurry and become very strong and dangerous and be moving inland on you before you really have time to prepare. So you really need to pay attention to the tropics, especially now that climatology is suggesting that not only is the Gulf region overdue, but also much of Georgia is due for a tropical system. There are several hazards associated with tropical systems, especially as they move inland. Tornadoes can occur frequently, especially within 24 hours of landfall and mainly to the northeast of the center track. Strong winds can be pushed well inland, knocking down thousands of trees and power lines, especially to the right of the hurricane path. Inland flooding continues to be the leading cause of tropical cyclone deaths due to the copious amounts of rainfall causing widespread flooding. One example of the tornado threat that impacted Georgia was Katrina. It made landfall over the central Gulf Coast region and remained more than a state to the west of Georgia, yet the outer bands produced 16 tornadoes across Georgia on August 29, 2005. A good example of strong tropical force winds moving well inland was Hurricane Opal in 1995. Hurricane Opal rapidly intensified in the Gulf and moved inland in just 3 days, carrying their strong winds well inland, knocking down more than 10,000 trees in more than 50 Georgia counties, more than 4,000 trees in the Atlanta area alone. More than 1,200 power poles were knocked down and almost 5,000 power lines snapped. There were numerous deaths associated with falling trees across Georgia. One of the latest examples of tremendous amount of rainfall and flooding caused by a tropical system was from Hurricane Francis in September 2004. Heavy rainfall along and to the right of the center led to significant flooding across Georgia and the Carolinas. Orographic lift along the mountains resulted in 10 to 20 plus inches from northeast Georgia across the western Carolinas, with some areas receiving as much as almost 24 inches of rainfall. Widespread flooding caused several deaths across the area. I wanted to make a couple points about the National Hurricane Center's forecast cones. They are a representation of the probable track of a storm center, and they don't tell you anything about the impacts. So the impacts or the hazards associated with that tropical system can come well outside of those cones. Those are just the forecast cones of air. And they only incorporate about 2/3 of the storm tracks in the past history. So there's 1/3 of those storms came outside of those cones of air. So that's important to keep in mind as well. But what's really important is that it doesn't tell you anything about the impacts. They can come well outside of those cones. Now that we looked at some of the conditions that might make the hurricane season at least normal or slightly above normal, and we looked at some hazards, let's take a look and see what the experts are saying. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center has come out with their forecasts, and their 2016 Atlantic Hurricane Season Outlook shows that they have a 70% chance of at least getting 10 to 16 named storms, of which 4 to 8 could become hurricanes, and of these, 1 to 4 could become major hurricanes. NOAA predicts a 45% chance of a near normal season, but also predicts there is a 30% chance of the season becoming above normal. Other experts are predicting a near normal or slightly above normal season as well. Colorado State University is predicting 13 named storms. Of those, 6 will be hurricanes, and of those, 2 major hurricanes, while the Weather Channel is predicting 14, 8, and 3. AccuWeather is predicting 14, 8, and 4, and they're also predicting that U.S. named storm landfalls will be 3. And then, of course, you have Weather Bell predicting 12 to 13 named storms. Of that, 7 to 9 will be hurricanes, and of those, 3 to 5 will be major hurricanes. So it does look like all the experts are predicting at least a near normal or slightly above normal hurricane season. So putting it all together, ENSO-Neutral conditions are favored to develop during the Atlantic tropical season, and this coupled with warm Atlantic sea surface temperatures would favor development. And so the predictions are from the experts that a near normal or slightly above normal season can be expected across the Atlantic tropical basin. Here are the tropical names that will be used in 2016. We've already seen Alex in January. Bonnie just occurred late May. And here are the rest of the names that you can expect to hear through the season in 2016. And just a reminder, the peak of the season is September 10th. So we've got a long way to go, and it officially doesn't end till 30 November. So keep your eye on the tropics this year. For a quick summary, current El Niño conditions are rapidly weakening, expected to transition into ENSO-Neutral conditions for much of the summer. May transition actually into a La Niña by mid to late summer, but neutral conditions are expected for most of the tropical season. Expected patterns suggest near to slightly higher than normal Atlantic tropical season based on climatology and warm temperatures, and transitioning to a neutral pattern with less wind shear across the Atlantic Basin. Now remember, Georgia has not gone more than 2 years without being impacted by a tropical system since 1990. And Georgia just went without an impact in 2014 and 2015, suggesting Georgia is due in 2016. Remember, the hurricane return period along the north-central Gulf region is 7 to 11 years, and their last impact was Katrina in 2005, so that region is overdue as well. Experts are predicting a near normal or slightly above normal season for 2016 as well. So please keep an eye on the tropics in 2016 and get prepared for any possible impact during this year.